There was a moment in history when eternity came with a price tag, not metaphorically, literally. Forgiveness could be purchased, punishment could be reduced, and salvation, once framed as divine grace, began to resemble a transaction. This wasn't rumor or heresy. It was official policy, preached from pulpits, recorded in ledgers, enforced by the most powerful institution in Europe. For a time, heaven ran on receipts. This wasn't a fringe abuse on the margins of faith. It was a system carefully constructed, widely accepted, and extraordinarily profitable. If there was ever proof that markets can invade anything, even the afterlife, this was it. If you love the real stories behind money and power, hit like and subscribe before we go on. Now let's dive in. To understand how indulgences became a marketplace, you have to understand what the medieval church was. Not just a religious body, but a transnational power structure, operating across fractured kingdoms, weak states, and constant war. Kings came and went, borders shifted, but the church remained. It owned vast land, administered courts, educated elites, recorded births and deaths, and most importantly, claimed moral authority over every soul. That authority was powerful, but complex. The church was a spiritual guide, a political force, a legal institution, and, in many places, the only safety net people had. Monasteries fed the poor, housed travelers, cared for the sick. But charity wasn't what made the church expensive. It built cathedrals, meant to rival heaven, financed crusades, and maintained bureaucracies stretching from Rome to the edges of Christendom. And unlike modern states, it had no standing tax system, no way to simply raise income taxes or issue bonds. It needed revenue that felt legitimate, voluntary, and spiritually justified at a scale far beyond local charity. So, it did what every durable institution does under financial pressure. It monetized what it controlled, and the church controlled access to salvation, or at least the framework through which salvation was understood. Medieval theology held that sin created a kind of spiritual debt. Even after forgiveness, punishment remained, on earth or in purgatory. This wasn't fringe doctrine. It was mainstream belief, deeply internalized by people who lived close to death and took the afterlife seriously. Originally, indulgences weren't about money. They were tied to acts of devotion, pilgrimages, prayers, charitable works. The logic was simple. Demonstrate repentance through sacrifice, and the church would recognize it. But over time, something shifted. Acts of devotion were standardized. Sacrifice was quantified. And eventually, money replaced effort. Cash was easier than pilgrimage, faster than penance, more scalable than prayer. What began as moral discipline slowly turned into liquidity. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences could be purchased directly. Preachers traveled town to town offering reductions in spiritual punishment for payment. And this wasn't a flat price, it was a market. Rates varied by sin, by status, by urgency. A modest payment, often a day's wage, might promise relief for minor offenses. Larger sums were encouraged for serious sins, faster absolution, or indulgences applied to loved ones already believed to be suffering in purgatory. Wealthier buyers were urged to give more, not because grace cost more, but because they could afford it. In modern terms, it was market segmentation centuries before the phrase existed. And the messaging was emotional. Why suffer in purgatory when relief was available now? Why leave parents, spouses, or children trapped in the afterlife when a contribution could help them ascend? The offer wasn't framed as greed. It was framed as mercy, conveniently priced. Fear became a revenue stream. This system scaled with remarkable efficiency. Indulgences required no enforcement beyond belief, no way to verify outcomes, no way to audit the afterlife. Trust did all the work. People lined up willingly, driven by guilt, anxiety, and hope. When salvation becomes transferable, demand takes care of itself. If there was ever a perfect product, it was one no one could independently test. Behind the scenes, the money was split between Rome, local bishops, and secular rulers, who allowed the campaigns everyone took a cut. Funds flowed into projects like the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a monument to eternal glory financed by very earthly transactions. And this is where it crossed a line, because indulgences stopped feeling like guidance and started feeling like sales. Preachers like Johann Tetzel perfected the pitch. One famous line captured the whole operation. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. When forgiveness becomes scalable, abuse becomes inevitable. And the people paying weren't elites playing abstract financial games. They were peasants, laborers, families living close to the edge.
For them, indulgences weren't theology, they were insurance against eternal suffering. But once belief behaves like a market, people notice the pricing. They compare.
They question whether grace should fluctuate with income. And quietly, trust begins to erode, not because people lost faith in God, but because they began to suspect the institution managing access to Him. Once the church turned salvation into a transaction, it didn't collapse right away. For a while it worked exactly as intended. Money flowed, projects were funded, authority appeared intact. Belief systems don't shatter overnight. They fracture slowly, where lived experience collides with contradiction. And the problem was structural. Indulgences created a market where inequality was no longer merely social or economic, but eternal. Wealthy sinners could buy relief. The poor were left with prayer, fear, and patience. Grace, once framed as universal, now behaved like a tiered product, and markets are very good at revealing uncomfortable truths. Once pricing exists, comparison follows, and once comparison follows, legitimacy is questioned. The breaking point didn't come from Rome. It came from the edges, where the transaction felt most exploitative, and the justification thinnest. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther reacted not as a revolutionary, but as an auditor. He didn't challenge sin, purgatory, or faith itself. He challenged the mechanism whether the church had any authority to sell reductions in punishment and whether money could substitute for repentance. His 95 Theses weren't a manifesto, they were a catalogue of where the numbers no longer made sense. And what made indulgences uniquely dangerous was that they were visible. Unlike abstract theological debates, they came with receipts, prices, and sales pitches. People didn't need education to grasp the problem. They'd already felt it in their wallets. The response from Rome wasn't reform, it was defense. Because by then, indulgences were embedded in the church's financial architecture. Too many projects depended on the revenue. Too many alliances were built on the flow of funds. Admitting error wasn't just a moral risk, it was a balance sheet catastrophe. So the institution doubled down. And that changed Europe. Once belief fractured, it couldn't be contained. Printing presses amplified criticism faster than authority could suppress it, and local rulers, resentful of papal influence and eager to keep wealth in their territories, found political advantage in breaking from Rome. What began as a dispute over indulgences became a full-scale reordering of power. The Reformation wasn't just a religious schism, it was a financial one. Money stopped flowing to Rome. Lands were seized, church assets were redistributed, faith decentralized, authority fragmented, and the monopoly on salvation collapsed. Indulgences didn't disappear because they were immoral. They disappeared because they failed to sustain trust. Once people stopped believing the system was fair, its revenue model collapsed. When a system monetizes belief, trust is the only asset that truly matters. This is where the story stops being about medieval Christianity and becomes uncomfortably modern, because indulgences weren't unique. They were an early example of something we see again and again. Institutions selling relief instead of solving problems, monetizing fear instead of reducing it, offering symbolic absolution in place of real change. When anxiety becomes profitable, there's little incentive to eliminate its source. Today, salvation isn't sold in churches, but reassurance is sold everywhere: convenience premiums, guilt-based consumption, financial products designed not to build wealth, but to ease psychological discomfort. The language changed, the incentives didn't, and that's a lesson far beyond religion. Markets are powerful, but blunt instruments. They allocate resources efficiently, but they don't understand meaning. When they invade spaces built on trust, identity, or morality, they don't just extract value, they reshape behavior. Faith became transactional, authority became conditional. Once salvation could be priced, it could be questioned. And once questioned, it could no longer command unquestioned obedience. That's the deeper truth indulgences leave behind. Power depends on legitimacy more than force. Money can amplify authority, but it can't replace it. When institutions trade trust for liquidity, they gain short-term stability and long-term fragility. Europe didn't just change its theology after indulgences, it changed its relationship with authority, accountability, and conscience. And the ripple effects reached politics, finance, and eventually the modern state itself. Whenever an institution sells moral relief instead of earning trust, it risks the same fate. Because when belief becomes a marketplace, legitimacy becomes fragile. And when legitimacy breaks, no amount of revenue can buy it back. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this gave you a new perspective on how money and power really work, hit like and subscribe, because history always has the answers. You just have to know where to look.